What happens to a region when the people who keep it running can no longer afford to live there? That question is becoming more important across Northeast Florida as housing prices and rents continue climbing throughout Jacksonville and St. Johns County. While most real estate headlines focus on luxury developments, new master plan communities, and high profile growth projects, another conversation is becoming increasingly urgent behind the scenes: the need to preserve attainable housing for working families, seniors, and long-term residents before it disappears entirely. That's why the 2026 acquisition of Pinewood Apartments by the St. John's Housing Partnership matters far more than it may appear at first glance. On the surface, it's simply an apartment transaction. There's no luxury branding attached to it, no waterfront towers, and no major ribbon-cutting event designed to attract national attention. But in reality, deals like this are becoming some of the most important transactions happening anywhere in Northeast Florida because they directly address one of the region's fastest growing challenges: affordability. Over the past several years, Northeast Florida has experienced explosive population growth fueled by relocation demand, job expansion, and Florida's broader appeal as a lower tax, business-friendly state. New residents continue arriving from higher cost markets across the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast, bringing purchasing power that has pushed both home prices and rents significantly upward. For homeowners, rising values often feel positive because they build equity and strengthen long-term wealth. But for renters and middle-income households, those same increases create mounting pressure. As property values rise, apartment communities become more attractive redevelopment targets. Investors often reposition older complexes into higher-end properties, raise rents to match surrounding growth, or redevelop sites entirely to maximize returns. That cycle gradually removes attainable housing inventory from the market, and once those units disappear, replacing them becomes extremely difficult. Construction costs, insurance costs, land prices, labor shortages, and financing challenges have all made affordable housing development far more expensive than it was even a few years ago. In many cases, building new attainable housing now requires subsidies, public-private partnerships, or nonprofit involvement simply to make projects financially viable. That's why organizations like the St. John's Housing Partnership are increasingly shifting their focus toward preservation. Instead of waiting for affordable communities to disappear and trying to replace them later at a much higher cost, they are acquiring existing properties and protecting long-term affordability before market pressures permanently change them. Pinewood Apartments represents exactly that type of strategy, preserving housing access in one of the fastest growing and most competitive parts of Northeast Florida before rising demand pushes even more residents out of reach.
What makes this issue especially important is that affordability is no longer just a low-income housing conversation. Increasingly, the pressure is impacting what many experts call the missing middle: teachers, healthcare workers, hospitality employees, first responders, retirees, and service industry professionals who earn too much to qualify for many housing assistance programs, but not enough to comfortably absorb rising rents and home prices. In high-growth regions like St. Johns County, that gap becomes more visible every year. The county's strong school system, carefully planned communities, expanding retail environment, and proximity to Jacksonville's economic centers have made it one of the most desirable places to live in the state. Communities like Nocatee and other master plan developments continue attracting buyers from around the country who are willing to pay premiums for lifestyle, schools, and long-term stability. But as wealthier buyers continue entering the market, pricing pressure spreads outward across every housing segment. New construction naturally trends toward higher-end product because builders must offset rising material, labor, and infrastructure costs. Over time, that leaves fewer options for residents who have lived and worked in the region for years. And this isn't just a housing issue, it's an economic issue. Regions need workforce housing in order to function properly. Hospitals need nurses and technicians who can live nearby. Restaurants and hotels need staff within commuting distance. Schools need teachers who aren't forced farther away every year by rising housing costs. If affordability disappears completely, labor shortages intensify, commute times increase, and the broader economy begins to strain under the weight of imbalance. That's why preserving communities like Pinewood Apartments matters beyond the residents themselves. Stable housing creates stability in every other area of life. Families avoid displacement. Children remain in the same schools. Workers maintain access to jobs. Local businesses retain employees. And neighborhoods preserve a healthier economic mix rather than becoming exclusively accessible to higher income households. There's also a deeply personal side to affordable housing preservation that often gets overlooked in larger real estate conversations. For many residents, ownership changes create fear and uncertainty because they've seen what happens when older apartment communities are sold in fast-growing markets. Rents increase, renovations begin, lease renewals become difficult, entire communities can change almost overnight when nonprofit housing groups acquire properties specifically to preserve affordability. They provide something increasingly rare in rapidly growing regions: predictability and stability. That sense of security can make a massive difference for families already navigating rising living costs across nearly every other part of life.
Looking ahead, affordable housing preservation will likely become one of the defining real estate conversations shaping Northeast Florida over the next decade. Jacksonville and St. Johns County continue attracting new residents at a rapid pace. And while that growth creates economic opportunity, it also places enormous pressure on the housing market. More luxury projects will continue being built. More master planned communities will expand outward. More investment will flow into the region. But growth without affordability eventually creates imbalance, and cities across the country are already seeing the consequences of that imbalance play out. Communities become economically divided. Workers are pushed farther from job centers. Infrastructure strains under longer commutes and population displacement. The challenge moving forward is creating a market where growth and accessibility can coexist rather than compete against one another. That's why transactions like Pinewood Apartments are more significant than they appear on paper. They represent an effort to preserve part of the housing ecosystem before it disappears completely. And preservation is becoming just as important as new construction. Northeast Florida will absolutely need more housing inventory across all price points in the years ahead. But protecting existing attainable housing may prove equally critical in maintaining long-term regional stability. From a real estate perspective, this also reflects a broader shift in how housing conversations are evolving. The market is no longer only about appreciation, investment returns, or large-scale development. Increasingly, the conversation includes sustainability, workforce accessibility, and whether growing regions can continue supporting residents across multiple income levels. Because ultimately, successful cities are not built solely around luxury development or high-end growth. They're built around balance. A healthy market needs teachers, healthcare workers, service employees, retirees, young professionals, and families all participating in the local economy together. The St. John's Housing Partnership's acquisition of Pinewood Apartments is one example of an organization trying to protect that balance before more attainable housing inventory disappears under the pressure of rapid growth. And as Northeast Florida continues evolving, efforts like this may become some of the most important investments shaping the region's future, even if they never generate the same headlines as luxury towers or billion-dollar developments. I'm Luke Christmas, and it's always Christmas when you work with Christmas Homes.